In the spring of 2012, every farmer in Harlan County, Nebraska, planted corn. This was not a decision, it was gravity. Corn was what Harlan County did the way the Platte River ran east, not because anyone chose it, but because nobody could imagine anything else. The county had planted corn through the Depression, through the farm crisis of the 1980s, through drought years and flood years, and every kind of year the sky could invent. The elevators were built for corn. The equipment was calibrated for corn. The loans were written against corn. And in the spring of 2012, with corn futures sitting at $6.20 a bushel, and every agronomist in the state telling farmers to push every available acre into production, there was not a single person in Harlan County who thought planting anything else made any sense at all. Let me tell you about what happened in May of that year, because it is the reason this story exists, and it is the reason that one farm in Harlan County looks different from every other farm in the county today. The planting window in Nebraska is not generous. You get roughly 3 weeks in late April and early May, when the soil temperature, the moisture, and the calendar all agree with each other. Miss that window, and you're chasing it for the rest of the season, planting into ground that is too warm or too wet or too dry, watching your yield potential shrink with every day you fall behind. Every farmer in Harlan County understood this. They had understood it for generations. And so, when the planting window opened in the last week of April 2012, every tractor in the county went to the field at roughly the same time, pulling the same equipment across the same kind of ground, guided by the same GPS auto steer systems that had become standard issue on every new cab-over row crop tractor sold in the state since about 2008. The GPS systems were the pride of the county's newer operators. They were accurate to within 2 inches. They eliminated overlap, reduced input waste, allowed a tired farmer to plant through the night without drifting a row. The dealerships in McCook and Holdrege had sold these systems hard for 4 years running, and the farmers who had bought them had never regretted it. They were faster. They were more precise. They were, by every measurable standard, better than what had come before. On the morning of May 3, 2012, a cellular network outage took down the RTK correction signal that every one of those GPS systems depended on to maintain its 2-inch accuracy. The outage started at 4:47 in the morning, before most of the county was even in the field. By 6:15, when the first tractors were rolling, the GPS units were showing degraded accuracy warnings. By 7:30, the auto steer systems had locked out entirely. The tractors were still running. The planters were still attached. The seed was still in the hoppers. But the guidance systems had gone dark, and the auto steer had disengaged, and every farmer who had bought one of those precision systems in the last 4 years was now sitting in a cab looking at a screen that said, in various ways, that it could not do what it had been sold to do. Some of them tried to plant anyway, steering manually through fields they had not hand-guided in years. The rows wandered. The overlap was brutal. One operator near Republican City planted 60 acres before he realized his rows were drifting nearly 8 inches per pass, which meant he was going to have a compaction problem down the center of every other row for the rest of the season. He stopped. Another farmer north of Alma tried to use his old light bar guidance, the kind that predated RTK auto steer, but the bar had not been calibrated in 3 years, and the accuracy was worse than useless. He stopped too. By 10 o'clock in the morning, most of the county's newer equipment was sitting at the field edge or parked back at the farmstead, waiting for the network to come back up. The cellular company said it would be 12 to 24 hours. Possibly longer. That was 12 to 24 hours out of a 3-week planting window. In a county where every day of delay costs yield potential, where every farmer was already watching the calendar like a man watching a fuse burn, that was not a small thing. It was the kind of thing that made grown men sit in their truck cabs and stare at the field and say nothing for a long time. Let me tell you about Dale Whitmer, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did that morning. Dale was 61 years old in the spring of 2012 and had farmed the same 480 acres his grandfather had broken in 1931 on the south side of Harlan County, 3 miles east of the small town of Stamford. His grandfather, Roy Whitmer, had come to that ground with a team of horses and a one-bottom plow and had turned the first furrow in the same year the county's corn prices collapsed to nothing. His father, Eugene Whitmer, had taken over the farm in 1962 and had run it until a bad back and a bad year in 1988 had convinced him to let Dale have the operation. Dale had never left. He had never wanted to leave. The 480 acres was not a business to Dale Whitmer the way it was a business to some of the newer operators who had come into the county in the 2000s with borrowed capital and aggressive expansion plans. It was the place where his grandfather had built something from nothing, and where his father had kept it going through years that should have broken it, and where Dale intended to keep it going until he could hand it to someone who understood what it was. Dale was a watcher. He was not a complainer, not a man who attended meetings or wrote letters to the extension office or argued with the dealership about what equipment he should buy. He watched. He had watched the GPS systems come into the county with the mild curiosity of a man who had planted straight rows by eye for 30 years and did not feel particularly disadvantaged by the absence of satellite assistance. He had watched the auto-steer demonstrations at the farm shows in Grand Island with the same expression he wore when he watched the weather. Attentive, skeptical, not dismissive, but not convinced. He had not bought one of the systems, not because he couldn't afford it, though the $15,000 price tag for a full RTK setup was not nothing on a 480-acre operation. He hadn't bought it because he had looked at the system and thought about what happened when it stopped working, and he had decided he preferred to own something that didn't have that particular failure mode. His tractor was a 1978 John Deere 444. Green and yellow and worn in the way that equipment gets worn when it has been used hard and maintained carefully for 34 years. He had rebuilt the engine in 1994. He had replaced the hydraulic pump in 2003. The cab was original, with the original AM radio that still picked up the Holdrege station on clear mornings. There was no GPS receiver on the roof. There was no guidance screen on the dash. There was a foam pad on the seat and a thermos of coffee in the cup holder and a set of row markers on the planter that Dale had calibrated himself the previous fall, walking the field with a tape measure and a notepad, setting the marker arms to the exact width that would put the next pass's outside row in the right place relative to the last pass's mark in the soil. He had been doing it that way since 1981. Let me tell you about the row markers, because most people under 50 have never used them and don't know what they are, and they are the reason this story goes the way it does. A row marker is a simple arm that extends out from the side of the planter and drags a small disc or scratch point through the soil as you plant. It leaves a visible line, a scratch, really, just a slight depression in the surface, exactly halfway between your current pass and where your next pass needs to be. When you finish a pass and turn around for the next one, you drive your tractor so that the center of your front axle tracks directly over that scratch line. If you do it right, every row is exactly where it needs to be. No satellites, no correction signal, no screen. Just a line in the dirt and a driver who pays attention. It requires something that auto steer does not require. It requires the farmer to watch, to look ahead, to feel the tractor's drift, to make small corrections constantly. The way you steer a boat against a current rather than setting a course and letting the autopilot hold it. Dale Whitmer had been doing it for 31 years in 2012, and he was very good at it. On the morning of May 3rd, while the county's newer tractors were sitting at field edges waiting for a cellular signal, Dale Whitmer hitched his 1978 4440 to his 12-row planter, loaded the corn seed he had already cleaned and treated the week before, and drove to his south field at 6:45 in the morning. He did not know about the network outage. He would not learn about it until later that afternoon, when his neighbor Gary Fessler drove past on the county road and stopped to ask if Dale had heard what happened to everybody's GPS. Dale had not heard. He had been planting since 7 o'clock. He was on his 14th pass. Let me tell you about what happened at the Harlan County Cooperative Elevator in Alma that same morning, because that is where the other part of this story lives. The co-op in Alma was the place where the county's farmers gathered when they weren't in the field, for seed, for fuel, for chemical, and for the particular kind of conversation that happens when men who work alone all week find themselves in the same parking lot at the same time. On the morning of May 3rd, with half the county's planting equipment sitting idle, the co-op parking lot had more trucks in it than it normally saw on a weekday morning. The farmers were not happy. They were the specific kind of unhappy that comes from watching a planting window close while your equipment sits in the yard. A man named Brent Caldwell was holding court near the service counter. Brent was the sales manager for Midwest Precision Equipment, the dealership in McCook that had sold most of the county's RTK guidance systems over the previous 4 years. He was 43 years old, wore a company jacket with his name embroidered on the chest, and drove a truck that was 3 years newer than most of the trucks in the parking lot. He had sold $2.3 million in precision agriculture equipment in Harlan County alone since 2008. And he was proud of that number in the way that salesmen are proud of numbers. He was at the co-op that morning because 3 of his customers had already called him, and he had driven up from McCook to explain the situation and manage the damage. "It's the network," he was saying to the group of farmers gathered around him. "The correction signal went down. It's not the equipment, it's the infrastructure. Nobody could have anticipated this." He said it with the particular confidence of a man who has explained something so many times that he has stopped questioning whether the explanation is adequate. One of the farmers, a younger man named Kevin Strauss, who had bought a full RTK system the previous year, asked what they were supposed to do in the meantime. Brent said they could try to plant on the degraded signal, but he wouldn't recommend it for the accuracy tolerances they were used to. He said the network would probably be back up by the next morning. He said this was a one-time event. It was Gary Fessler who mentioned Dale Whitmer. Gary had driven past Dale's field on his way into town and had seen the 4440 making passes, the row markers scribing their lines in the soil, the planter dropping seed in the ground at the same pace it had been dropping seed since 7 that morning. Gary said it almost as an aside, the way you mention something that seems obvious once you've seen it. "Old Dale Whitmer's been planting all morning," he said, No GPS, no guidance, just the row markers. Been doing it that way his whole life? The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then Brent Caldwell started laughing. It was not a mean laugh exactly. It was the laugh of a man who has spent 4 years explaining why old methods are inadequate and who finds the suggestion that one of those old methods might be relevant in the current moment to be genuinely amusing. It was the laugh of someone who has confused the sale of a technology with the mastery of a problem. "Row markers," he said, still smiling. "That's great. That's really great. You know what kind of accuracy you get with row markers? You get plus or minus 4 inches on a good day with a good operator. You know what kind of accuracy you get with RTK? 2 inches, all day, every day, no matter who's driving." He looked around the group for confirmation. A few of the farmers smiled. A few did not. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched someone dismiss a solution because it came from the wrong direction? Not because the solution didn't work, but because it didn't fit the story they had already decided was true? Brent Caldwell was not a stupid man. He understood precision agriculture better than most people in that county, but he had built his professional identity around the idea that the new way was better than the old way, and that identity had become a wall he could not see over. The laugh was not about row markers. The laugh was about what row markers represented. The possibility that the $15,000 system he had sold to a third of the county might not be the only way to plant a straight row. Gary Fessler drove back out to Dale's farm that afternoon. Dale was on his 32nd pass by then, moving across the field with the steady, unhurried pace of a man who has done this so many times that the motion has become part of him. Gary rolled down his window and asked how it was going. Dale said it was going fine. Gary told him about the network outage, about the farmers sitting in town, about Brent Caldwell's laugh. Dale listened to all of it without changing his expression. Then he said, "Well, the ground doesn't know the difference." He rolled up his window and made his turn. "Let me tell you about the next 3 days, because they matter." The network came back up the following morning, as Brent had predicted. The county's GPS-guided tractors went back to the field, and by the end of May 5th, most of the planting was caught up. The window had not been missed, though it had been compressed. The farmers who had lost a day were not ruined. They were behind, and behind in a planting window has costs, but the costs were manageable. Dale Whitmer finished his 480 acres on May 6th. He had planted the entire farm in 4 days, working from first light to last light the way he always did during planting season. His rows were straight, not 2-inch straight. Nobody with row markers and a 34-year-old tractor is going to claim 2-inch accuracy. But they were straight in the way that fields planted by experienced operators are straight, which is to say straight enough that the rows ran true from one end of the field to the other. The canopy would close evenly, and the combine would not have to fight the geometry when it came through in the fall. The county noticed. Not loudly. Harlan County was not a county that made noise about things. But the farmers who drove past Dale's fields on the county road in the weeks after planting saw the rows, and they knew what they were looking at. A few of them stopped at the end of the field and got out of their trucks and walked the edge of the rows the way farmers do when they are evaluating something. Nobody said much, but they looked. Brent Caldwell drove past Dale's south field on May 12th on his way to a service call near Alma. He slowed down. He did not stop, but he looked at the rows for a long time before he drove on. Let me tell you about the summer of 2012, because the story does not end with the planting. The drought of 2012 was the worst in the Midwest since 1988. It came on hard in June and did not relent. By July, the corn across Harlan County was showing stress that the farmers had not seen in a generation. The stalks were rolling their leaves, the ears were not filling, and the yield forecasts that had been written in April against $6.20 corn were being revised downward every week. The county average yield, which had been projected at 178 bushels per acre in the spring, came in at 94 bushels per acre that fall. It was a brutal year. Dale Whitmer's corn averaged 97 bushels per acre, 3 bushels better than the county average, which in a drought year is not nothing. But the number that mattered more than the yield was the input cost. Because Dale had planted with row markers and a 1978 tractor, his per-acre input cost for planting was $23.40. The county average for planting inputs, including the amortized cost of precision guidance systems, the fuel burn of newer equipment, and the service contracts that came with the technology, was $31.80 per acre. In a year when the yield was half of what anyone had planned for, that $8.40 per acre difference was the difference between a year that hurt and a year that broke you. Dale Whitmer did not break. He had a bad year, but he had been farming long enough to know that bad years were part of the work, and he had built his operation to survive them rather than to maximize the good ones. Let me tell you about the conversation that happened in October of 2012, because it is the one that matters most. Brent Caldwell drove out to Dale Whitmer's farm on a Tuesday morning in the third week of October, after the harvest was in and the fields were bare, and the county had had a few weeks to absorb what the year had cost. He pulled into the yard in his company truck and found Dale in the shop, doing the post-harvest maintenance on the 444. Oh, that he did every fall. Draining the hydraulic fluid, checking the injectors, going through the planter row units one by one the way his father had taught him to do it. Brent stood in the shop door for a moment, watching. Then he walked in. Dale looked up from the planter frame he was working on. He did not say anything. He waited. "I owe you an apology," Brent said, "for the laugh at the co-op." He said it plainly, without a lot of preamble, the way a man says something he has been rehearsing for a while and has decided to just say directly. "I shouldn't have done that." Dale set down his wrench. He looked at Brent for a moment. Then he said, "Sit down." Brent sat on an overturned 5-gallon bucket near the workbench. Dale pulled up a shop stool and sat across from him. The shop smelled like hydraulic fluid, and the particular dry dust smell of harvested fields in October, and the light came in through the west window at a low angle the way it does in the fall, and for a moment neither man said anything. "The system you sold is a good system," Dale said finally. "I'm not arguing that. 2-inch accuracy is 2-inch accuracy. I can't do 2 inches with row markers. I know that." He paused. "But your system needs 3 things to work. It needs power, it needs a signal, and it needs somebody who knows what to do when it doesn't have those things." He looked at Brent steadily. "My system needs one thing. It needs somebody paying attention." Brent was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The network outage cost my customers about 2,000 acres of planting time across the county." He said it not defensively, but factually, the way a man counts a cost he has been sitting with for a while. "I know," Dale said. "Gary told me." "How do you keep your rows straight?" Brent asked. It was a genuine question, the kind that comes after the defensiveness has left a man, and what is left is just curiosity. without the guidance. How do you actually do it? Dale stood up and walked to the shop door and pointed out toward the south field, which was bare and brown in the October light. You pick a point, he said. Far end of the field, something fixed. A fence post, a tree, the corner of a building. You drive to that point. You don't look at the ground in front of you, you look at the point. And you make small corrections constantly, the whole length of the pass. And when you come back the other direction, you follow the marker line. He paused. The marker line tells you where to be. The fixed point tells you where you're going. You need both. Brent looked at the field for a moment. Then he said, "That's what the GPS does. It gives you the fixed point and the correction signal at the same time." "Yes," Dale said, "it does, and it does it better than I can. On a good day, with a good signal." He looked at Brent, "But it doesn't do anything on a bad day." Brent drove back to McCook that afternoon with something that had not been there when he drove out. A specific and uncomfortable understanding of the gap between what a system can do and what a system can do when everything is working. He did not stop selling precision guidance systems. He was a salesman, and they were good systems, and the county needed them. But he started having a different conversation with his customers after that fall. He started asking them whether they had ever planted with row markers. Most of them hadn't. He started suggesting that they learn. Let me tell you about what happened at the Harlan County Extension Office in the winter of 2013, because the story doesn't end in Dale Whitmer's shop. The extension agronomist that year was a man named Paul Gertz, who had been covering Harlan County for 11 years and who had watched the precision agriculture adoption curve with the professional interest of someone whose job was to evaluate what actually worked. Paul had been compiling the 2012 yield data from across the county, and he had noticed something in the numbers that he wanted to understand better. The farms that had lost planting time to the network outage had, on average, planted 4 days later than the farms that had either not been affected or had been able to plant through the outage. In a drought year, 4 days of planting delay translates to roughly 3 to 5 bushels per acre of yield loss, because the crop's critical pollination window shifts later into the heat of July. The county average of 94 bushels per acre already reflected that loss. The farms that had planted on time, including Dale Whitmer's, were, on average, 3 to 5 bushels per acre above the county average. Paul put that number in his winter newsletter. He did not name Dale Whitmer. He did not say anything about row markers or 1978 tractors. He simply noted that the network outage in May had created a natural experiment in planting timeliness, and that the results were consistent with what the research said about the relationship between planting date and yield in drought years. He suggested that farmers consider what their backup plan was if their primary guidance system became unavailable during a critical window. The newsletter went to 340 farms in Harlan County. Dale Whitmer read it at his kitchen table on a January morning and set it down and drank his coffee and did not say anything about it to anyone. But 6 farmers called the extension office that winter asking about row marker calibration. Paul Gertz referred 3 of them to Dale Whitmer. 2 of those 3 drove out to Dale's farm in February when the ground was frozen and there was nothing to do in the fields, and spent an afternoon in the shop while Dale showed them how the marker arms worked, how to set the width, how to calibrate the scratch depth, and how to use a fixed point at the far end of the field to keep a pass straight. Dale showed them the way his father had shown him, without ceremony, going through the steps in order, answering questions when they came, not volunteering more than was asked. One of those two farmers was Kevin Strauss, who had bought the full RTK system from Brent Caldwell the previous year, and had been one of the men sitting in the co-op parking lot on the morning of May 3rd. Kevin was 34 years old and had been farming for 8 years and had never planted a row without some form of electronic guidance. He sat in Dale's shop for 3 hours that February afternoon and asked more questions than the other farmer combined. At the end of the afternoon, he asked Dale if he could come back in the spring and watch him plant a few passes before he tried it himself. Dale said yes. Let me tell you about the spring of 2013, because it is where the story turns forward. Kevin Strauss came out to Dale's farm on the first morning of planting, before the sun was fully up, and stood at the end of the south field and watched Dale make the first 4 passes. He watched the way Dale set his fixed point, a telephone pole at the far corner of the field, 3/4 of a mile away. He watched the way Dale's eyes moved, not down at the ground but up and forward, tracking the pole, making the small corrections that kept the tractor on line. He watched the row marker arm scribing its line in the soil. He watched Dale come back on the second pass, centering his front axle over the marker line with the calm precision of a man who has done this 10,000 times. After the 4th pass, Kevin walked out to the tractor and asked if he could try. Dale climbed down from the cab and Kevin climbed up. He made 1 pass. It was not as straight as Dale's passes. It was not bad, either. When he came back and parked the tractor and climbed down, he stood there for a moment, looking at the row he had just planted, running his eye down the length of it. Then he said, "Okay, I see it." He went home and put row markers on his own planter that week. He kept his RTK system. He was not Dale Whitmer, and he was not interested in being Dale Whitmer. But he had a backup now, and the backup was calibrated and ready, and he understood how to use it. In May of 2013, the RTK network did not go down. The planting season went smoothly for everyone in the county, and Kevin Strauss used his guidance system the whole time and did not need the row markers. But they were there, and he knew what to do with them. Let me tell you one last thing about Dale Whitmer, because the story has one more turn. In the fall of 2019, Dale's son, Marcus Whitmer, came home from 3 years of working on a large operation in western Kansas to take over the farm. Marcus was 32 years old and had spent those 3 years running equipment that made Dale's 444 look like a museum piece. 400 horsepower row crop tractors with full RTK guidance, section control, variable rate application, the whole stack of precision technology that had become standard on large commercial operations. He was good at it. He understood the technology in the way that people who grow up with something understand it. Not as a tool they had adopted, but as the normal way that farming worked. Marcus sat at the kitchen table with his father in October of 2019 and talked about what he wanted to do with the operation. He wanted to update the equipment. He wanted to add GPS guidance. He wanted to bring the farm into the precision era that it had, in his father's hands, largely bypassed. Dale listened to all of it. He didn't argue. He said, "That all sounds right. Do it." And then he said, "But learn the row markers first, before you put the guidance on. Plant 1 season with the markers, so you know what you're doing when the guidance isn't there." Marcus looked at his father for a moment. He was thinking about the 3 years in Kansas, the thousands of acres he had planted with guidance, the straight rows that came out of a system rather than out of a driver. He was thinking about whether his father's request was practical wisdom or nostalgia. Then he thought about May of 2012, which he had heard about from Gary Fessler and from Kevin Strauss and from at least 4 other people in the county over the years, and he said, "Okay." He planted the spring of 2020 with row markers on the 444-0, which Dale had kept running and which started on the 3rd crank of the key on the first morning of planting. It was the hardest planting season Marcus had ever had. Watching a fixed point for a quarter mile at a stretch, making corrections, following the marker line on the return pass, it was physical and mental work in a way that auto steer was not. By the end of the first day, his neck hurt from holding his head at the angle that kept the telephone pole in his sight line. By the end of the first week, he had stopped noticing the neck. By the end of the season, he understood something that he had not understood before, which was the relationship between the driver and the machine and the ground, the way those 3 things have to work together when there is no system doing the work for any of them. He put the RTK guidance on the tractor the following spring. He used it every day of the planting season, and it worked perfectly. But the row markers stayed on the planter. He had recalibrated them himself with a tape measure and a notepad, the way his grandfather had taught his father and his father had taught him. In May of 2021, a software update pushed to the guidance system's controller module corrupted the calibration file for the field boundaries. The system spent 40 minutes trying to reestablish its baseline before Marcus gave up and disengaged it. He planted the rest of that morning on row markers. His rows were straight. Not 2-inch straight, but straight. He finished the field before lunch. Dale Whitmer is 63 years old now and does not farm the ground himself anymore. He walks it sometimes in the evenings the way his father used to walk it, looking at the soil structure and the residue breakdown and the things that take years to see. Marcus runs the operation. The 444-0 is still in the shop, still maintained, still starts on the 3rd crank. Marcus has not decided what to do with it yet. His daughter is 9 years old and has already asked if she can drive it someday, and Marcus has told her yes, and that when she does, he will show her how to set the row markers and how to pick a fixed point at the far end of the field, and how to keep her eyes up and forward and make the small corrections that keep a row straight without any help from a satellite. The GPS told every tractor in Harlan County to stop on the morning of May 3rd, 2012. One farmer who had never asked a satellite for directions finished planting alone. His rows were straight. His crop went in on time. His yield, in the worst drought in a generation, was 3 bushels per acre better than a county that had bet everything on a signal that wasn't there when it mattered. Some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for people to remember why they were built. And the ground, as Dale Whitmer said on a May afternoon, while a county full of tractors sat idle at the field edge, doesn't know the difference.